It's such a pleasure always to talk to ACS chapters, and I'm blushing from the introduction. So I want to make sure that I give credit to my co-authors here because tonight I'm speaking as the Red List coordinator for cetaceans for the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And so I had a lot of help from sort of the team that does the assessments for cetaceans. That's Randy Reeves, Gianna Minton, Jill Browlick, and Grant Abel. And so I'm going to do quite a bit of introduction about, let me see, why is it not advancing? Hold on here. There we go. About what the red list is, how we go about classifying species according to the level of threat, how different groups of creatures are doing, and in specific, how cetaceans are doing. I'll talk then about sort of what the major threats are globally, and then I'll talk about the most endangered marine mammals and conclude with what can be done. So the red list, most of you have probably heard about it, but a lot of people don't know its real purpose. Its real purpose is to look across all the species of the world and be able to give a global biodiversity thermometer. So how are things doing generally? And that's a huge task. And so there are these specialist groups that take on different taxonomic groups, including the cetacean specialist group. And I was very happy to see that you are, thinking globally and acting locally. It's a great environmentalist proverb from, sort of back when I was a 20-year-old. But now I think it has to be also act globally. Almost everything that we do is interconnected with everything else in the world. And so it's so important to think about all of those levels at once and both act globally and act locally. So the IUCN list of threatened species has seven different categories. And two of them are extinct and extinct in the wild. Probably this year we will be officially listing Baiji, the Yangtze dolphin, as officially extinct. Then there are these three threatened categories: critically endangered, endangered, and vulnerable. And you'll see those colors because that's what I'm going to be concentrating on tonight. Then there's near threatened. Those come close to meeting the quantitative criteria that puts them in a threatened category, but not quite. And there's least concern. But there's also this category of data deficient. We used to have very many cetaceans that were in this data deficient category. And now we have relatively few, but we still have some, mainly beaked whales, where they truly are so data deficient that no one's seen them alive in the wild. That's what I call data deficient. So I'm going to concentrate on the threatened categories, and I'll just dive right into it. The way that the threats are assessed is I have this spreadsheet on my desk at all times, this one pager, and I'm not going to go into all of the specific details, just to let you know that it's designed to handle everything from bacteria to blue whales. And so they have a number of different criteria that can do that. And you have to meet one of these five, and the one that you meet at the highest level of threat is how you're classified. So there's declining population, reduced geographic range, small population size and decline, a very small population or a very restricted distribution, and finally a quantitative analysis or a PVA. And almost all cetaceans are listed under A, C, or D, We never use B. Even river dolphins and vaquita don't qualify, but it's the most common category for plants. So it's every taxa uses a slightly different criteria, and ours are almost always based on abundance and trends. You can use the data that comes out of all of these assessments to look at this, what they call a red list index of species survival, where basically it's good if you're at one and you get worse and worse, sort of going down the scale. So if you look across all species, that blue line shows sort of what's happening to biodiversity generally. And this is the kind of data that they take to, UN forums and Convention on the International Trade in Species. I mean, it's meant to be at a high global level to indicate to people how we're doing in terms of biodiversity. And you can see that mammals are doing way better than corals, but that they are declining about the same rate as birds and amphibians. If we go into a deeper dive for our cetacean friends, you can see that we actually have an increasing proportion of cetaceans that are in categories of threat. So in 1991, it was 15%. In 2008, it was 19%. And now we're up to 26% of cetacean species are in a category of threat. That means one in four. And throughout all of that, there's only been two to three species that have actually moved up and gotten better. So although I think we'll be seeing more of that in the future, near future actually, with large whales. But we were able to take an even closer look and look at where are those threatened category species. So we sort of broke up into these four categories: river, coastal, shelf, and open ocean. And you can see that 100% of river species are in a category of threat, and 60% of species that are found in coastal waters, which is shocking. It sounds way worse when you look at it this way. I mean, it's like if you have to live near people, things are not going well for you. And you can see that a lot of the least concern are on the shelf or in the open ocean. So we've got some problems to deal with. If you want to read about this in more detail, we published a paper in Conservation Biology in 2022. I'd be happy to send people the PDF, and it goes into a lot more detail about how we did the analysis. But another thing that I'd like to highlight is that we also looked at whether there were any global hotspots where the threats were more dire. And you can see that Southeast Asia, which of course is a perfect storm of, tremendous amount of coastline because there's lots and lots of islands and a really high density of people using gill nets. And so it's a really difficult area, and it also, as I'll talk about later, has a lot of habitat destruction that is a major threat there. Despite all of that dire sounding introduction, it's actually probably underestimating by quite a bit what the proportion of cetaceans are that are in categories of threat. And here's an example. We have a lot of taxonomic uncertainty. As I'm sure you've heard from other speakers, it's pretty difficult to get the amount of data that you need to convince taxonomists that you have a new species of mammal. And here's an example with the Sousa species. So in that original set of assessments, we had only two species of Sousa. We had Sousa tutsi and then another big species of Sousa that covered a huge area of the globe. And so it was considered to be least concern because it had a huge range and consequently a much higher abundance. But when those were reclassified into three different species, all of them were in categories of threat. And we'll probably see a lot more of this type of problem being, make slowly made progress in bottlenose dolphin species. I mean, there's almost a new species a year and probably killer whales. Anyway, this will continue to be something that happens, and it almost always means that we have underestimated the level of threat. I also wanted to talk about one of the things that the cetacean specialist group has been moving towards, which I'm a big fan of, and that is in lots of cases because taxonomy moves so slowly and uh, conservation crises are so rapid that we don't want to neglect listing things on the red list because we don't know whether they're a full species or not. So there's quite a few Irrawaddy dolphins that are in fresh water. All of them are listed as subpopulations and they're listed as critically endangered. So that's good because many of the countries don't have domestic marine mammal legislation, and the researchers can go and say, hey, look, we have critically endangered marine mammals in our rivers. Um, but it doesn't show up in those statistics that I just showed you because they aren't listed as species, and that's the way IUCN operates. But so if you go on the IUCN red list and you look up Irrawaddy dolphins, it'll give these subpopulations. And I think we'll be moving towards doing more subpopulations because really, when it comes to doing conservation planning and actions, it's more at that scale than it is frequently for cetaceans at the global scale. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the most endangered marine mammals, and then I'm going to give some positive examples where we've gone, fortunately, towards recovery. But as you can well imagine, I couldn't talk to ACS without mentioning what's going on with vaquita. It is the most threatened animal globally, and I'm sure you all know about where it is and how threatened it actually is. So, some of you have probably seen this before, but I think it's relevant to talk about how difficult it is for these coastal cetaceans generally, not just vaquitas. A lot of them, like those Sousa species that I was talking about, have similar properties to vaquita, that they're in small groups, they're small animals, and you often need, absolutely flat, calm waters to be able to see them. And so with vaquitas, that means that we have to have these very big binoculars, which I'll show you in a moment. And those in turn have to go on pretty big ships. And so it's made it really hard to get the data that we need, the abundance and the trends, to be able to get a real good status assessment on these small cetaceans. Now hopefully this will go more smoothly. Okay. So way back in the early 1990s, there was a study on how many vaquitas were killed in gill nets, and the estimate was 78 animals a year in all types of gill nets, from the very smallest gill nets to the very largest ones, which are set for the totwaba, which is the fish that you see the gentleman holding there. And we, at the time, didn't have a good abundance estimate. But fortunately, through time, we've been able to come up with not only methods like using these big binoculars, which we are still using out there every single year, but also adding acoustics, which has been really helpful for coastal small cetaceans generally, and certainly for vaquita specifically, because we could put these out in the shallow water in the areas where the ships couldn't go, but also because it's much less expensive and it meant that we could monitor every single year and be able to tell what was happening with the vaquitas and give that feedback to the government of Mexico in this case. So you probably all know about the drastic decline of vaquita, but the science was there to tell us that it was happening. In lots of cases with small coastal cetaceans, like Burmeister's porpoise in Peru, we just don't have those data. And so again, they're actually listed as near threatened, and they probably are something much worse than that. But we just don't have the data yet, and still working on improving methods to be able to get that down more accurately and to advise the governments and the fishers on what the status of those animals are. As you know, we the recovery team did a last-ditch effort in 2017 to try to take as many vaquitas as possible into human care because of this drastic decline. And that was sadly a failure. The calf that you see here was exhibiting stress and was released. And then the female that we caught seemed to be doing well, but died of capture myopathy. And that was the end of being able to use this as a way to save vaquitas. And it was too little too late. And things continued to look very dire. There, when we went out to do surveys, the waters were just filled with gill nets, so much so that we couldn't track vaquitas to take photographs of them. But fortunately, the Mexican Navy put these concrete blocks with these 3-meter high metal hooks in the area where most of the vaquitas were spending most of their time, which is now called the zero tolerance area. And it's had an amazing effect. I mean, just such a simple thing has been so amazingly effective. So we go out every year. It's a collaborative effort where the Mexican scientists do all the acoustic research. We use the acoustic data almost in real time to tell us where to go look for vaquitas so that we can see them and photograph them. And every year since 2018, we've seen in this sanctuary that's protected by these blocks about 10 vaquitas. And I'll share some nice video with you. This individual we've seen almost every year. The adult there is named Frida. She has a bent dorsal fin. So like Frida Kahlo, who is a very famous and wounded Mexican. Uh, she is still living a full life and having a calf almost every year. The calf that you see here is just over a year old. We saw her last September. And if you watch Frida closely and she turns on her side, you'll see that she has quite a bump there. So we're hoping that we go out in May and we see Frida with a new calf. And of course, this good news actually matches up with the genetic research that we did that showed that vaquitas have a very low genetic load. So we don't expect them to have any genetic issues from inbreeding. Okay, I don't want to, there we go. So this is a painting I did of Frida with what I hope will be her new calf that we'll see in just over a month. And we have a contest that's going on that some of you might have gotten a link to, where the Indianapolis Zoo has an endangered species awareness program where they're doing the bracket of March Madness, but for endangered species. And vaquita were one of the species that was chosen to highlight. And this is a clip that
Right now, fewer than
Lorenzo put
10
together.
vaquitas, porpoises, remain in the wild. That's not a population, it's a final chance for this species. The good news is we know exactly how to save them. Vaquitas die in illegal fishing nets, and when those nets are removed, vaquitas can recover. If the IUCN Cetacean Specialist Group receives the 10,000 prize, we will use it where it matters most, on the ground, immediately. Bringing vaquita conservation closer to local communities is essential for its survival. Big eyes binoculars allow young people from these communities to directly participate in monitoring and protecting the species. This is not just equipment, it's a bridge between the vaquita and the people who live alongside it. It builds connections, awareness, and long term commitment. Investing in this effort means investing in the next generation of conservation stewards. Right now,
So I'm going to unabashedly ask you to go vote for vaquitas. We're in a 50-50 tie with, get this, spiny yellow lousewort. And we're almost to the end of this competition, but it is right now 50-50, and you've got up till midnight to vote. So we'd appreciate your vote. And we actually, this May, are dedicating the survey to training local youth to actually be full observers in the next May's survey. So it's a great thing to be able to have binoculars that stay right there in San Felipe. And when they get good weather on the ships, on the Sea Shepherd ships in the winter, we'll have local trained observers that can go out and look for vaquita. And so we really hope that we can make this happen. So that's the end of all my bad news. Now I'm going to actually get to what can we do and some more good news. So what needs to be done? I mean, it's so clear that we need to convert fisheries in Mexico to use something other than gill nets. So that's a real local problem, but it's a real global issue. Gill nets kill hundreds of thousands of marine mammals every year. Some of that seafood is local, like some of the seafood for San Felipe is local, but a lot of it is global. And the US is one of the largest consumers of international seafood. So there's a lot that can be done to motivate the market and incentivize these fishers to switch gears to something that is truly sustainable. And of course, these gill nets kill many other long-lived, slow-reproducing species like sea turtles, dugongs, sharks, and seabirds. Another problem is fish maws. So the totoaba is valued for its swim bladder, which is also called a maw in Asia, which is where most of the market is. And now this has become a huge global market and a huge issue for all of these species that are getting gill netted for their maw. And here you can see the red list of all of these species that are globally distributed. And then you can see the Convention for Migratory Species and the Convention for the International Trade in Endangered Species and how these species are listed on there, but they're not being directly killed. It's the fish maw, which is not so far threatening those species of fish, but is incidentally taking down these other species. And these conventions are really not set up to deal with that. And it's really something that needs some shift in the way people think about things and some shift in how they list things in these various conventions. This is what fish maw looks like. And conservationists, of course, we have an important role because we have the data and we need to keep telling the story. But in my opinion, all of you have a much bigger role to play, and consumers in particular, we're all consumers, have a huge role to play. We need to really start asking for seafood that is not caught in gill nets, and just don't buy gill net caught products. And also, we need to raise this issue of fish maws. It's just becoming, it's a very rapidly increasing problem. And of course, we have to be willing to pay for what I'll call blue market seafood. It costs a bit more to catch with different gear than it does with gill nets, which are very cheap and efficient. But gill nets are never going to be a sustainable gear. Oh, I'm sorry. I do have another sad story. So the other most critically endangered cetacean is Rice's whale. And as I'm sure you all know, it was recently described as a new species in the Gulf of Mexico, and there's only about 50 individuals left. And unfortunately for them, when they're resting at night, they spend most of their time at the surface and they're very vulnerable to ship strikes. On the right, you can see the current distribution of Rice's whale, that red area. And they're a very unusual whale in that their preferred habitat is right along the shelf break. And there was a lovely paper by Randy Reeves that showed that 100, 200 years ago, they were all around the shelf break in the Gulf. And so now most of them are in that one area. And I was part of the team of scientists that assessed Rice's whale as to whether it was an endangered species or not. And these are the data that we looked at. So on the top, you can see the critical habitat is in gray, actual detections of Rice's whale are the little dots. And you can see there's a couple of them over on the shelf break, sort of between Louisiana and Texas. There's a lot more data now from acoustic data, that long-term acoustic recorders that show that there are Rice's whales regularly along that shelf break. And then you can see below, the figure below, the ship traffic, which is just stunning. And the really red area below Louisiana Delta and off over towards Texas, that really intense area crossing that shelf break, is all supply ships out to oil rigs. And a lot of that happens at night and at high speeds by pretty big ships. So it's a real danger zone for Rice's whales. And like the North Atlantic right whales, the proposal is to, in the area, that little band of 300 to 400 meter deep water, that the ships slow down so that the whales can get out of the way and not get killed by ships. And that is not popular with the oil industry. So there's some recent events that I thought this group should know about if you haven't heard about this. The fellow on the top there, Secretary of Interior Burgum, was tapped to lead the efforts to rename the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. And he was appointed as the Secretary of the Interior, the National Energy Dominance Council. I'd never even heard of such a thing. But just about a week ago, on March 16th, the Trump administration announced that it would convene the Endangered Species Committee, which is also called the God Squad. For those of you who don't know ESA, Endangered Species Act history way back, that God Squad was formed because there was a small fish called a snail darter that was holding up building a big dam, Tellico Dam. And so they made this committee, which it turns out is the um, cabinet level positions that can override the Endangered Species Act and knowingly condemn a species to extinction. And this hasn't been convened in many, many years. And so they just announced that they are convening it, and it will be led by the Secretary of the Interior. And he's called a meeting for next Monday. So the move, if you go to the National Resource Defense Council website, is to not to be able to override any restrictions on the speed of ships within the Gulf. So anyway, I asked the folks at NRDC um, what I could recommend that people listening to the talk tonight could do for this sort of emergency situation. And they recommended that you call your congressional representative or senators and tell them to oppose the exemption. And to reach out if you have any Florida friends and family, because Florida has been very strongly against oil development and would be very influential in this particular instance. They also pointed out that offshore oil development in California is sort of the next step if, they sort of are successful in the Gulf of Mexico. California is the next place where offshore oil, um, they would like to have more development. So it certainly has relevance for our own coastal cetaceans as well. So let me talk about other threats. I mentioned habitat loss, and again, this is the biggest problem in Asia, but it's a global problem. Damming of rivers, expanding of ports, this thing they called reclaiming of land, which actually means just filling in shallow water areas, which destroys mangroves that all of those Sousa species depend upon. We've all heard about increasing ocean noise, more shipping, more noise, and it makes finding food and whales finding each other much more difficult. Climate change is the big unknown. I personally was really shocked at what a huge impact the warming event that we had in the North Pacific had on humpback whale populations. I mean, they took a major hit, and it wasn't something that I anticipated. And I think we'll see a lot more surprises in that regard. Sort of more predictable, there are certainly going to be food chain interruptions with sea ice declines and shifts in prey distribution. Pollution and microplastics, they're known to have killed some individuals, but as yet, we don't know that they're having population level effects. So now I am on to good news. So that's me when I was probably about 20. I was working in the Arctic counting bowhead whales. And at the time, there were roughly 1,000 of them. They were endangered. Yankee whaling had wiped out in a period of just over a decade, had almost completely wiped bowhead whales out of the North Pacific. Now they've recovered almost to historical levels. And it just blows my mind that the whales that are swimming around today, almost all of them have been born since that picture of me was taken. So, I mean, that's just such a heartwarming success. I also worked in Southeast Alaska in the 1970s, 1980s, and at that time there were about 300 humpbacks, and now there's 10 times that. And humpbacks have gone from endangered to least concern. So, I mean, it's a real example of if you stop killing animals and you have some healthy environments, they can recover quite nicely. Another one that I've gotten to witness just in the past couple of decades is the Yangtze finless porpoise. They were doing very poorly, sort of following, sadly, in the fluke prints of their dolphin cousin. But the government of China recognized what a crisis the mother river of China, the Yangtze, was in. And they did a lot of policy changes, including banning all commercial fishing for 10 years. And I just came from there last November, and they're seeing recovery of the fish populations. And the Yangtze finless porpoise are doing very well for two reasons. One is these oxbow lakes that they put animals in as an insurance population, and they are just having tons of babies. I mean, they're starting to release them now back into the river because they have more than they can handle. Um, this is a couple of years ago in one of the Oxbow lakes. The guy with the big camera is the Minister of the Environment of China. He took pictures of Yangtze finless porpoise, but also those animals that you see on the right, clearly not marine mammals, are Pierre David's deer, and they're another conservation success story. They came back from 8 individuals, and now there's hundreds of them. So, you know, it's really great to see what the animals can do. And the recovery of the environment itself was remarkable. So this is from the BIG survey that I was on in 2006. And this is the same thing in 2019. And that's not very many years, but you know, there's swans, you know, flying over the river, and the river is just a remarkably different place. So if you have a, you know, a strong-willed government, you can actually make some amazing environmental changes very rapidly. The other thing I wanted to leave you with is sort of my personal education. There was a really interesting workshop that I attended in 2022 on the human dimensions of small cetacean conservation. And at that meeting, I got to meet conservation psychologists, conservation sociologists. I mean, it was amazing to me that all these social scientists had conservation training, specific training to deal with changing human behavior. And all conservation is about changing human behavior. And I'm not personally not very good at it, but these folks are great at it. And so I think it's really important that we um, recognize that we have these other skills that we can bring in to help change human behavior, which is a darn tricky thing to deal with. And I've already talked a bit about how consumers can play a big part, and groups like, you know, ACS can help raise awareness. You know, I think most people have no idea that, you know, what they're eating in a restaurant might be driving a species extinct. And, you know, educating the restaurateurs and, you know, we just have that unique perspective that we can bring as consumers. And then the other thing that's just so important, and there's so many of you here that are naturalists that are going out and doing whale watching, any chance that you get to bring decision makers out with you and have them experience the wonder of seeing whales and dolphins, absolutely do it. It can be a life changer, and you never know what opportunity is going to be something that makes a big difference. But, there's, you know, a lot of our decision makers are so immersed in sort of day-to-day crises, and being able to leave that behind and go out and see whales, it's a big deal. So you have the opportunity to make a big difference. And the other thing I think that this organization does very well, and that we need to continue to do more of, is inspiring and mentoring young people to care about nature. And, to see that the quality of our lives and of future generations are, that you need to be connected to have a healthy earth. And we need to find ways to make those connections. And I was so impressed with what they've done in China with Yangtze finless porpoise, where they built all these walkways right along the river and put up places and showed pictures so that people could see, hey, these animals are living right in these major cities in the middle of China. And all of a sudden they have a huge fan club. So making those connections, that's the local part that I think is really important. I think the harder problem is sort of raising that to a global level. So I wanted to show that a lot of these species that I was talking about, they have local organizations that are doing amazing work on the ground. And it's great. We have Zoom and we can connect with all of these different citizen and scientist organizations. They all come up with different ideas and how to deal with things. And they certainly all need, support. So I think there is a real way to, be better globally connected than we ever have been able to do in the past. So with that, I'd like to thank you again for inviting me to speak with you. And I understand that I can take some questions and answers. And yeah, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.